Good morning, everybody. If I can grab your attention, please, we're going to get this show underway. My name is Will Inboden. I'm the Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security, one of your co-hosts for today, along with the Intelligence Studies Project, and of course the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, represented by my good friend and colleague, Bobby Chesney. So this is the 5th annual Texas National Security Forum. And over these last 5 years, if I can humbly say, we think that this conference has become the premier national security gathering on any university campus in the country, and we're very honored to be doing that here at UT. So, that's right, thanks. We hope that some of those good vibes carry over to the game tomorrow up in Arlington. So anyway, Professor Chesney may comment on that. So each year for this conference, we select a theme that seems to reflect a pressing national security concern. Our past few themes in previous years have been, the first one was on intelligence reform and counterterrorism, asking whether we're smarter and safer with the CT and intel reforms after 9/11. The next year, we did an assessment of the complex global threat environment. The year after that, in the fall of 2016, we did a conference on national security and presidential transitions, and how the different national security equities are handled during the peaceful transfer of power. And then last year, our theme was the role of allies and partners in national security. And so now this year's theme, the return of great power competition. What do we mean by this? Well, the last great power standoff was between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And for the first couple decades after the Cold War's peaceful end, American foreign policy focused primarily on good things like expanding open markets and democratic institutions, while addressing transnational and non-state actors such as terrorism, weapons of mass destruction proliferation, civil wars, humanitarian crises, and rogue regimes. But in the last few years, a shift has taken place in the international system with the continuing rise of China and then the resurgence of Russia. And so we're now seeing a return of great power competition as the primary global reality, the primary geopolitical dynamic in the international system. This doesn't mean that those other issues don't matter: terrorism, WMD proliferation, cybersecurity. They do very much, but even more so in the context of great power competition. So, for example, the current conflicts and instability that are besetting the Middle East also occur against the backdrop of the tensions between Russia and the United States in that region, each of us trying to exert influence there. Likewise, the ongoing tensions in Asia over the South China Sea, North Korea's growing nuclear weapons program. These are also occurring against the backdrop of China's growing assertion of power and influence. For similar reasons, the new era of cyber and hybrid threats, information operations, trade tensions, these also occur as new domains in the great power competition. So I'm going to turn it over to Bobby now to set the scene for what we're going to be doing today and make some appropriate thanks.
So as Will said, we have a lot to talk about, and to explore these issues, we've assembled some of today's finest strategic thinkers, some of our most experienced national security professionals. It's really quite an amazing crowd. I'm so excited about it. I hope you are too. Our speakers today have collectively served in every presidential administration, from Presidents Nixon through to the current president, Donald Trump. They've held some of the most senior positions in the intelligence community, the National Security Council, the State Department, at the Pentagon, in the ranks of the uniformed military. We're very honored to have them gathered with us, and we're eager to learn from them today. Now, Will talked about how we convene this group every year. Why do we do this? It's not just because it's the day before the rematch of the Red River rivalry, although that's a pretty good reason. I will note, you may hear some hoopla around 11 or so. There is a huge pep rally that's going to take place. Just to go off script a bit, we were terrified when we learned that they were originally thinking they'd hold the pep rally here in front of the Alumni Center between us and the stadium around 11 today. We have some dignitaries coming in around then. It's going to be on the other side of the stadium, but if you all slip out, well, as long as you're going to root for the Burnt Orange, that's okay, but come back afterwards. The real reason we convene this gathering, of course, is trifold. First, it helps fulfill the university's responsibility to serve the nation, to serve the public, to help educate our citizens and inform public policy. It exposes our students to national security professionals and to important ideas that are shaping the world that they're inheriting from us. It's providing an opportunity for our distinguished speakers to escape the East Coast and enjoy some balmy late November Austin weather, not to mention some good old-fashioned Texas hospitality. And of course, we're going to have a lot of fun along the way. Now, before we welcome the first panel to the stage, Will and I want to thank the valiant staff members of both the Clements Center, the Strauss Center, and also the Intelligence Studies Project. They're a hell of a team, and they've been laboring mightily for truly months. And insofar as you don't notice what work might need to be done, that's because they've worked so hard to make it seamless and not noticeable. Let us mention in particular Paige Buffkin, Kathy Evans, Elizabeth Dowdy, Alex Vermuden, Ashley Carrion, Ann Clary, Allie Prince, Carolyn Dockery, and Alex Foggett. Please join us in applauding all their hard work. Naturally, almost all of them are out of the room, unable to know how much we appreciate them, but we will tell them. So thank you very much. And let me ask Will to come back up briefly to introduce our first panel. Thank you for being here.
All right, so I'm now going to call up to the stage Dr. Lorinc Redei, who is a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, where I'm a professor as well, and he also runs the Masters in Global Policy Study program there, and he's going to be moderating our first panel on world order. So, Dr. Redei, please come up, and then you can bring your team up as well.
Get our entire team to come up. All right, so good morning, everybody. Thank you to Will and to Bobby for putting this wonderful forum together. I have the honor to moderate this first panel today. And we've been given the very narrow and niche topic, thank you, Will, of world order. So my hunch is we'll need about half an hour, 35 minutes, then we'll be done. You'll have extra time for breakfast. But seriously, we have a distinguished panel of experts here to enlighten you on this crucial geopolitical topic. And I want to give our panelists as much time as possible to share their insights with you. And I also assume that all of the audience knows how to use Google. So I'm not going to give very long introductions. But in a nutshell, we have with us Tony Blinken, former Deputy Secretary of State and former Deputy National Security Advisor under President Barack Obama. We have Eric Edelman, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and former U.S. Ambassador to Turkey under President George W. Bush. And Kristen Silverberg, former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union and former Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs under President George W. Bush. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes to offer some short introductory remarks. Please keep to your time limit so that we can have as much interaction among the panelists afterwards as we can. Then I'll ask a few questions to get a conversation going, and then I want to use at least half of that Q&A time to take questions from the audience. So let's begin in the order that the panelists appear on the program. So I'm going to start with Tony.
Great. Lorinc, thank you very much, and good morning. I can't believe this turnout. I think most of you folks think this is actually the Longhorn send-off, but it's not, but we'll do our best to keep the excitement level. Will, Bobby, great to be with you. Wonderful to be here with my friends and colleagues as well. You know, as we're contemplating the question of world order, or maybe world disorder, I often get asked, you know, how I feel about the state of things. And I really like to quote the late Senator John McCain, who said memorably that it is always darkest before it goes completely black. And with that as a lead-in, what I want to talk about briefly is, before we get to a conversation, is this. I do think we're at a profound inflection point. And that inflection point is even broader than great power competition that we're talking about today, but great power competition really feeds into it and also accelerates it. And the inflection point is this, at least as I see it. If you look at the profound divisions that we're seeing around the world today, including in our own country, increasingly what we're seeing is not a division between left and right, Republican and Democrat, liberal and conservative. It really is a division between those of us who believe that confronted with incredibly complex change, the best answer is to kind of hunker down and play defense, versus those of us who believe that we somehow need to stay open and connected and do what we can to shape these forces of change to our advantage, or at least mitigate their downsides. In other words, to put it colloquially, it really is the difference between those of us who believe the answer to our interests in the future is to build a wall of some kind versus those who believe we need to keep building bridges. And I was in government for almost 25 years. And as I've spent the last couple of years trying to reflect, I've been asking myself how we got to this particular moment. And I think what I've come up with is not particularly novel, but it does reflect at least the ability to have had a little bit of time to look at things from a distance, not the day-in, day-out grind of government. So it seems to me that there have been three broad trends that have brought us to this moment. And they're no less important for being obvious. One, the extraordinary rapidity and depth of technological change, combined with this overabundance of information that we're all dealing with every day, and the sense that borders have eroded around the world, that's created a sense of chaos, of confusion, of vulnerability among so many of our fellow citizens, a sense that the world really is in disorder and they can't explain or understand how it works. And that's having a profound effect, again, on making people just feel out of sorts. Second, a paradox. Many of you have read people like Steven Pinker. They'll tell you that by virtually every metric, our country and indeed the world has never been better off than it is today. It's healthier, it's wealthier, it's wiser, it's more secure, it's even more tolerant. And yet, as we know, so many people have been left out or left behind from that progress. And maybe the best way to illustrate it is to say that over the last 25 or 30 years, if you look at it, there's been an extraordinary amount of progress in dealing with poverty around the world. The numbers are staggering in terms of improvement. But at the same time, we know inequality is actually rising. And the amount of money that a smaller and smaller group of people control has gotten bigger and bigger. And that feeds, coupled with the financial crisis in 2008, a growing sense of anger, resentment. And you combine that with this sense of chaos and confusion and vulnerability, and you start to get what is amounting to a perfect storm. And then one final trend, and that really does go to the heart of what we're talking about today. And that is just a profound shift in power relationships, not just among nations, but indeed beyond them, below them, on their side. So we've got the emergence of powers that Lorinc talked about, but we also have a whole host of new actors. It may be the mayor of a megacity, it may be a corporate chieftain, it may be a super empowered group or individual. And each has a much greater ability than ever before to kind of veto the decisions that traditional sources of authority, like a national government, would make. And you add to that, in so many, unfortunately, of our democracies, governments afflicted with political paralysis, with extreme partisanship, increasingly in different ways with corruption, and you wind up with a crisis of legitimacy in our institutions. So you put all of that together, and it creates an almost perfect environment where people are looking for those who project themselves as strong leaders with very simple answers to what are, at least in my judgment, pretty complex problems. And then you get a resurgence of nationalism, of populism, of xenophobia, unilateralism, isolationism of one kind or another. This is not a new story. We've been there before, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes and then turn it over to my colleagues recalling some of the lessons of history, because I think they're instructive for today. And after all, as we know, those who forget history are condemned to retweet it. So if you think about it, we've faced this choice before. After World War I, as many of the students here know very well from studying it, for understandable reasons, in a sense, we retreated. We decided to reject participation in the League of Nations. As economic troubles started to rear their head, we became protectionist. As dictators began to emerge, we became isolationist. And one result of this retreat was a global conflagration that made the first war to end all wars just a prelude to something even worse. And then after World War II, we got something that you rarely get, a second chance, a do-over. And we could have chosen to do the same thing. We could have chosen to pull back, given all that we put into that effort. We could have chosen to lord our power over everyone else, because at that point in history, we really were the last power left standing. Everyone else was afflicted with terrible challenges, but we didn't do that. Instead, we do what's been talked about a lot over the last couple of years. We took the lead, not in a neat linear way, but ultimately, if you look at the sweep of history, we took the lead in building a new order with institutions, with rules and norms that we took the lead in shaping and also defending. And in some sense, it was counterintuitive because we checked our own power. We constrained ourselves. We bound ourselves to these same rules and norms and institutions as everyone else. But it had powerfully positive effects. It meant that as a result of giving others a voice and a vote in the system, we prevented what usually happens in history when one power rises above others, and that's the others all get together to try and check its power. That didn't really happen. And second, by making very significant investments in the security and prosperity of other countries, we got that investment back 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. New markets for our products, new partners to deal with global challenges, new allies to deter aggression. And we all know this system was far from perfect. The ideals and the reality never perfectly matched. Colonialism, apartheid lasted for decades. We've had proxy wars and civil wars of one kind or another. And of course, all sorts of socioeconomic dislocations. But the big picture, preventing another conflagration among the great powers, and then lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, many into a global middle class, that's a pretty good success story. So the question for those of us who believe in the fundamentals of that system, even as we acknowledge it needs to be profoundly amended to account for those who are left out and left behind and don't feel that they're part of the system or progress, the challenge for those of us is to figure out right now how to amend it and how to really make clear that the alternatives are a lot worse. And that's what I want to leave you with. It seems to me that as we think about world order, we really face this choice. Either the United States continues to play the role that it's played for 70-plus years in helping to lead and shape that order, or one of two things. Either someone else or someone else will do it, but probably not to our interests and values, or maybe even worse, no one does it. And then we fall back into anarchy, what my friend Bob Kagan calls the jungle. That's the choice before us. That, I think, is the landscape as we're thinking about world order that we have to contend with.
All right. Thank you, Tony. Eric?
Thank you, Lawrence. It's great to be here. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Bobby, for inviting me and particularly for putting me on a panel with two terrific former colleagues. I had the privilege of working with Tony in the Clinton administration, and then when he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and I was in the Bush administration. I do find it a little disconcerting that I'm situated here on his left. That seems wrong somehow, but it's great to be reunited with Kristen, with whom I worked in the Bush administration, and then on a series of projects, including the Romney campaign, where we tried very hard to put Tony on the unemployment line. And
That's looking pretty good now.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you'd like to have us back now, wouldn't you? What's President Bush's approval rating? We worked together as well on a project to preserve conservative internationalism in the Republican Party after 2012, and you can see how well that's worked out. So it's really great to be here. I agree largely with what Tony said, but let me try and fill in some of the gaps that might be usefully addressed. So Lawrence and I were talking before the panel began about what the nature is of the period we have entered, and we don't really have a good taxonomy for it. The post-Cold War, the period that began with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992 and came to an end, I think, roughly around 2007, 2008, with the Great Recession, 25-year period, was marked by a couple of things. First, the United States was the unipolar moment. It was the sole remaining superpower. We had a vast preponderance of power, as Dean Acheson might have said, with regard to anybody else on the planet militarily. Essentially, our power was uncontested. It came on the back of the so-called third wave of democratization that Samuel Huntington identified in the 1980s, but which continued to roll through the 1990s and up to the early 2000s. It was a period of great power comedy. That is to say, the United States and China and Russia in the 1990s were trying to work together constructively to solve a bunch of global order problems that seemed pretty trivial compared to the big problems that had beset us during the Cold War. And we didn't always work very smoothly with either Russia or China, but still the general trend was to work together cooperatively, and certainly the cooperative part outstripped the competitive part. It was the end of history, as my Cornell classmate Frank Fukuyama described it, which is to say ideological competition seemed at a minimum. And in fact, everybody was agreed that the Washington Consensus, that free markets, open societies, freedom of capital movement were important parts of the global order. If you think about those elements today, almost every one of them has essentially reversed. If you think of those as pluses, you'd have to put a minus in front of every one of those. So the United States margin of military superiority has been shrinking since for the last decade anyway. Secretary Hagel in 2013 talked about the declining margin of superiority that the United States had vis-a-vis other great powers in the world, Russia, China. I've just chaired the National Defense Strategy Commission, independent commission chartered by Congress to review the Department of Defense's national defense strategy, and we have found, and it's a bipartisan panel, and we found unanimously that, if anything, Secretary Hagel was understating the issue. Our margin is much reduced. The wave of democratization has clearly gone into reverse. If you look at Freedom House's assessments of global freedom, the number of free countries has declined. And we see the rise of authoritarianism around the world, populist authoritarianism. You see it in Europe, but you see it in Asia as well, in the Philippines and other parts of the world. Ideological competition is back. It's not back in the form of capitalism versus communism, but there clearly is a ideological component, as my occasional co-author Hal Brands has argued, in the great power competition we see today between authoritarianism and continued belief in democracy and lowercase l liberal values. And on top of that, instead of great power comedy, we now see a return of great power competition. And that's something that was identified in the previous administration by Secretary of Defense Carter and has now become the organizing principle of the Trump administration's national security strategy released last December and the national defense strategy that was released in January of this year. There is some debate about whether there is such a thing as the normative, rules-based, liberal international order. And I think it's a little bit, in my mind, like Justice Stewart's definition of pornography, which is I can't really define it, but I know it when I see it. I think that, if anyone looks reasonably at the history of the international order since 1945, it is clear that the United States went about establishing a set of institutions and practices that were meant to reduce the chances of the kind of great power clashes that Tony was talking about that marked the 20th century in not a positive way, by having a more open trading system and by the United States, for the first time really in its history, taking on political responsibility for guaranteeing the security of others through its multilateral treaties with European powers in NATO and the bilateral treaties that it signed with East Asian powers in the course of the early 1950s. And then the special relationships that it developed with a number of Middle Eastern countries as British power retrograded from the region and left the United States responsible for the balance of power in the Middle East as well after 1966. The question we face today, as Tony says, is whether we are going to continue to support that system. And I agree with Tony that the alternative to it is it's not self-sustaining. The international order will not just keep on ticking over. It requires some power to manage it, and that's been true in the past. It was true when the British were managing the international system essentially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it now, unfortunately relies on us. I don't really see any other country that is either willing or capable of doing it for a variety of reasons that we can discuss. So I think the alternative is not that some other nation is likely to run the order, although China might step up 25 years from now and try and play that role. I'm not sure people will really like that. If you want to get a taste of what that might be like, I recommend you read Martin Jack's book, When China Rules the World. It's going to not be a world that people are going to find as congenial as the one that the United States has managed since 1945. The issue, I think, is whether we're willing to pay for this, because it will cost us money. It will require sacrifice by Americans to do this. And the danger I think we face right now is pretending that we are still willing and capable of doing this while not adequately funding what is required. And I don't just mean the military, I mean the international means that we have in our government, the State Department, the intelligence agencies, the Treasury, the other instruments of national power, in order to do it. I can think of no more dangerous place for the nation to be than to pretend that we are going to uphold this order and not have the means to do it.
Thank you.
Great. Well, first, I'm just thrilled to be here. I'm an Austin native and a UT Law grad, and have just been wowed. Thank you, Bobby, by what Will and Bobby have built here. It's just a incredible, impressive accomplishment. So thank you all for being here this morning. So as Eric was saying, I think there's we could spend all morning on the definitional question about what do we mean by world order. I mean something like the current alliance systems in Europe and Asia, the set of international institutions, and in some cases global treaties, the open trading system, and it's basically the web of relations and institutions that have helped to gradually build U.S. influence in the post-war period, and also to, I think, gradually spread kind of democratic values throughout the world. There are lots and lots of reasons why the current system is strained. Some of them are the great power issues that Eric just referenced. We have a more assertive Russia under Putin that I think would like to do away with the global order altogether and return to more of a spheres of influence system. We have a more assertive China under Xi, who I think likes the idea of a global order but wants to remake it in a way that serves China's interest. But to go back to some of Tony's comments, some of the biggest threats to the current order are self-inflicted on our part. And I'll just mention a couple of them. One is that the current system, the post-war system, was built in part around the gravitational pull of the U.S. economy. So through most of the Cold War, the Soviet economy was about half the size of the U.S. economy, and the Soviet bloc's major trading partners were countries like Cuba and North Korea. And so the Soviets could compete with us militarily. In some parts of the world, they could compete with us on values. They could meddle in our democracy by stoking dissent and racial tension. But there really wasn't an economic competition in any sense. And it was inevitable with that kind of an imbalance that we were going to win converts to our side. So when you look at from 1947, when the original GATT agreement was signed, the kind of early stage trade agreement, to 1986, the last round of the GATT, you had 23 signatories at the beginning and 123 signatories at the end. We just had a very compelling talking point that our system was going to help, make countries more prosperous. And I say this because every day that we don't tackle our long-term economic health, so every day that we don't deal with our fiscal situation, that we don't think about how we're going to educate poor kids, that we don't tackle some of the inequality issues and the lack of social mobility that Tony mentioned, is a day when we're giving the Chinese an extra talking point. We're not going to win this next round by default. The Chinese will be real competitors, and so one of the things we have to think about is that. The second big self-inflicted wound, I think, is our failure to think about this next stage in the global order in terms of a win-win. So I think, as Eric was saying, or Tony, we came out of the post-war period militarily, economically dominant, and we intentionally set up a system that would grow economies overseas. So we said we would rather live in a world where we had a little more economic competition, but in exchange for that got more stability, where we had more sort of countries bought into the system. And so the fact that we have more competition from emerging markets is a feature, not a bug, of the current system. It's actually one of its great successes. And sometimes in the debate in Washington here now, you think about, there's a sort of, we lost that win-win mentality, and whatever comes next in the sort of evolution of the world order, it's going to have to be one where there's an argument to other countries that they need to participate in our version of the system. So I really liked Eric and Tony's comments, in part because they avoided the problem you get at a lot of discussions in Washington about the kind of world order, which tend to fall into two extremes. They're sort of the anti-globalist crowd that says, why do we need a world order? We particularly don't need a liberal world order. We're just kind of happy with, let's make America great, and we're just going to keep to our own business. And then on the other side, there's a think tank crowd that seems to kind of lapse into hysteria. So the world's on fire, and I don't mean to pick on the Aspen Strategy Group because I think Tony's a member, but they put out a yes, exactly. They put out a report this year called "The World Turned Upside Down" or something. I mean, it's just it's a little topsy-turvy. It's not totally upside down yet. And so, one of the kind of orientations we need to take on this is to avoid, steer between these two shoals. So I think we need to adopt a kind of foundational framers mindset. So it can't be that we're just nostalgic for the old order. The fact that it served us so well over the last 75 years doesn't mean it's perfectly designed to serve us for the next 75. So we don't need hysteria, but we also have to think about a world order. The U.S. won't do well in the spheres of influence system that Putin has in mind, or in a kind of highly disorderly system. And so we ought to think about kind of what comes next. And I don't think the Trump administration is anywhere near sort of an actual strategy on this, but I think they're making some decisions that are going to have a key impact on kind of the long-term evolution of it. And there are some things they're doing I like, and some things I don't like, and I'll sort of talk about a couple of those. So on the kinds of things I disapprove of, they seem to be undermining the idea of a rules-based system. So on the one hand, you see some Trump administration trade actions that are meant to tell other countries that they need to abide by the rules that we negotiated. So for example, they've been criticizing the Chinese government for intellectual property and trade practices that are violation of global agreements, and that's totally appropriate and overdue, in fact. On the other hand, they seem to be making up some new rules as they go along. So they've used Section 232, which is this long-standing trade rule, to create some protectionist measures around steel and aluminum. They've threatened to use it around auto tariffs, and it's a kind of distortion of what that particular provision was meant to do. In my mind, the only system that's going to work for the U.S. going forward is going to be rules-based, meaning that we get other countries to abide by the rules, and we agree to abide by them too. And that's largely because we're a private sector-run economy. If you're if you're a authoritarian government like China, you can live with ambiguity in rules. If you're a private sector player, you have to have certainty, rule of law, and other things. So in my mind, one thing the Trump administration needs to get back to is the idea that we're going to have global rules, and we in the United States are going to abide by them. The second big mistake I think they're making is taking values off the table. So as I said, in the old, the current world order was built in part on sort of the strength of our economic case. So our predecessors certainly made the values argument, but even if they hadn't, we had such a strong and compelling economic case that countries probably would have been on our side anyway. In the next round, we're going to have real economic competition, and one of the things the U.S. is going to be able to bring to the table is that our system is better, it's more moral, it's more just. And so I think we're going to have to put the kind of question of U.S. values and the benefits of democratic and accountable systems back on the table. On the plus side, I think the Trump administration has done a really useful thing in revisiting our China strategy. So for the last kind of 20 years, we've had a pretty stable approach to China that's kind of focused on helping to get the Chinese engaged in the current system, what we called the kind of responsible stakeholder strategy. We promoted economic liberalization in China, and depending on who you talk to, you might have heard in the last couple decades this hope that China would liberalize politically. And I think a lot of things have changed the debate in Washington, made people less hopeful about all those things. Some of it is that changes in China under Xi. Some of it is that we see just a more confident China, more confident that it can manage its rise without liberalizing politically. And so I think the Trump administration has very usefully put on the table a kind of the list of U.S. grievances, everything from the trade and IP practices to assertiveness against neighbors to human rights, religious freedom, and so on. However, I think we're still in what I think of as sort of a pre-strategy phase. So right now we have the kind of list of grievances, but we don't have an actual strategy about how we're going to prioritize those or move forward. I've compared this to something like 1946, where there was sort of a growing appreciation in Washington about the Soviet threat, but there wasn't really a sense of how we were going to attack that, and it took this famous diplomat, George Kennan, to write something called the Long Telegram, which eventually came an article and eventually kind of found its way into a national security directive to focus the U.S. on what our priority was, which was basically to confront the Soviet expansion overseas. And that strategy sort of gave rise to basically guided U.S. policy till 1989. So I think the period we're in right now and the mandate, the call to our generation of foreign policy experts is to start defining that problem, to take our kind of list of grievances and turn it into an actual set of priorities and strategy. And I will stop there.
All right, thank you. So several of you mentioned the liberal world order as sort of the starting point of what happened to it or what is happening to it. And it seems to me that many of you argued that it's this idea that we had right after the Cold War ended, that this liberal world order is going to be universally accepted, everybody's going to join it, support it, that seems to have evaporated. But my question is, do you see anything else in terms of this moral underpinning or ideological underpinning of the liberal order that we used to have? Can anything else replace it? I mean, you were talking about how all these different countries are becoming potentially more closed off. What could replace the small L liberal descriptor of the world order? And if there isn't such a thing, can we have a world order that doesn't have that kind of, ideological underpinning? And if so, what would that world order look like? So maybe I'll start with Tony.
I'll just say very quickly, I think that, yes, really the choice is between some order and disorder, but within the order world, what's the nature of that order? And I think we've touched on that to some extent. I think the challenge we face is that if we are going through abdication to give up on reconstituting and amending the liberal world order, as my colleagues have said, then I think maybe sooner than Eric thinks, others will step up and there'll be an order, but instead of being liberal in its aspirations, it will be illiberal. And that's not something that I think would be good for us. And then, of course, the alternative really is not necessarily global anarchy, but at least anarchy in chunks of the world and this jungle that Kagan and others talk about. So I think that really is the choice.
I think it's dangerous for us to sit up here and talk about this as if it's some kind of abstraction. Mm-hmm. One of the things I think we've lost over the last 25 years of the post-Cold War is a sense of how bad things can really get in the international order and how violent they can be. Now, it's not like there's any shortage of violence in the world, with all due respect to Professor Pinker. I mean, I take his point that it's a secular trend downward, but if you're in Syria right now, you probably don't really take much solace in that, or in Yemen. But those are in sort of fairly, from our point of view, remote parts of the world. I mean, the prospect that we could have conflicts of the size and scale that we had in the Second World War is something that I think just absolutely eludes us. We just don't think about it. Partially we don't think about it because of the presence of nuclear weapons and the assumption that, things would go nuclear very quickly if you got into a great power war with either Russia or China. That might be true, but it also might not be true. And so there's a potential for, very long, very painful, and very violent conflicts. I mean, both sides had chemical weapons during World War II. Nobody used them. It didn't stop World War II from being an incredibly violent, destructive war, the most destructive war in the history of the world. And I mean, I've just been reading an astonishing book by Adam Towes called The Deluge about the last 2 years of World War II and the early efforts of the United States and the European powers put the world back together, and it's just a description of the violence going on in Europe at that time as a result of the Russian Revolution, the German offensives on the Western Front. I mean, it can get really bad. And so, it's fine to sit here and talk about, liberal world order or more disorder. More disorder could be, astonishingly bad. And when you say, what's the alternative to the liberal order? Well, the alternative in the years between the wars was countries becoming, attempting to become more autarkic, more autonomous, not abiding by any kind of rules in the system. And we know how it ended up. You don't get to run experiments very often in international affairs, but we know how that one ended. And I don't think it's a place any of us want to go again.
I think there are a few different alternatives if we sort of abandon the effort to sustain the order. One is the return to the kind of, a spheres of influence system. And I think that would be very bad for us. Those spheres of influence are inherently unstable because the lines of demarcation are contested. They're very bad for the countries who live under them, so they sort of undermine this concept of sovereignty. And three is that that doesn't parcel out the world in a way that actually works for our interests. So it basically gives, China, as the predominant power in the part of the world that's growing the fastest, Russia a lot of influence over some energy producing parts of the world. And so anyway, I don't think we'd be very unhappy under that system. Another alternative is that we, as Tony and Eric were saying, is that we have a global order, but it's one that's sort of reoriented to China's interests. And I'll say that we can see signs of China making moves in that direction. At the moment, they are purporting to offer something that's basically a kind of, what's purporting to be a win-win solution by offering these massive infrastructure investments in their neighbors. And there are huge downsides to those deals for some of the countries. They can create some unsustainable debt burdens. They can lose some of their governance, over key kind of national assets. But if we don't have anything to offer in its place, my guess is that countries are going to feel like that's their only alternative. So I do think there are alternatives to a U.S.-led global order, but they don't work out very well for us.
Mm-hmm. So to piggyback on that, if we're thinking about world order as mostly the structures that shape the relationships between the great powers, I think these do seem to be the alternatives. But what I wanted to ask you about is the G20 is going on this weekend in Buenos Aires, and one fourth of those countries that are being represented there actually have a smaller GDP than what Amazon is worth. So one thing that I think is different from our current attempts at world order is that there are other actors, especially in the economic sphere, who are way more powerful than the actors were in 1948. And so how do you see that playing out in terms of how the global world order is going to accommodate or be shaped by these economic forces that are not great powers, or at least not great state powers as we think of them? Maybe start with Kristen this time.
Sure. Well, I think, the system that, the great powers play a key role in kind of shaping the environment that gives rise to some of these important players. So the fact that we had a free market economy, that we have a system that promotes innovation and technology is part of why we have these massive companies. And one of the interesting dynamics I think that's going to play out over the next decade is the role of the big Chinese big techs, which are becoming enormous. If you look at a company like Alibaba or Tencent, they basically are Netflix, Uber, Amazon, Facebook, all kind of wrapped up into one company. But what's particularly interesting is they're all those things, but with close ties to the Chinese state. So they help to pursue, they're right now helping with the urbanization challenges and creating these smart cities. They're providing transportation systems, self-driving cars, but they're also playing a role in facial identification. So, things that will improve the ability of the Chinese government to monitor citizens. Some of the big, the fastest growing technology companies are partly owned by the PLA, by the, Chinese military. So anyway, so I think one thing we're going to see playing out in this year is competition between our kind of private sector firms, which are incredibly impressive and technologically driven, and their firms, which have the symbiotic relationship with the state and have control of massive amounts of data. And so we're going to have to think basically of a way of how are we going to compete economically when companies like that are competing not only in China but also in other parts of the world.
And this really risks, I think Kristen makes a really important point, because what we're at risk of seeing are the emergence of technological spheres of influence, where Chinese technology and the norms that it applies to that technology dominate in one part of the world. Ours may predominate in another. Some other country may emerge technologically and do the same. And that's why we have a profound stake in actually not only thinking about but acting on and shaping these rules. If we don't, I think that technological sphere of influence is going to emerge much more quickly than we think. And it's also why companies and government have a really powerful incentive to figure out ways to work together in ways that they haven't in the past. And, instead of seeing that, we're seeing, especially over the last 5 or so years, many of our major tech companies and government on a collision course, which worries me profoundly, because at the end of the day, if companies won't take responsibility for some of the excesses of creative disruption, if they won't do it, then government will. And then usually government comes in and overregulates, which doesn't really serve anyone's interest. But that's the trajectory we're on if folks don't stand up and take a little bit more proactive responsibility. And there's a real, I think, mutual interest in working together precisely to avoid the world cleaving off into different technological spheres.
Well, I largely agree with what both Kristen and Tony have said. I mean, in the National Defense Strategy Commission report, one of the issues we address, which at first blush you might think, why are they talking about this, is the issue of whether or not China ends up being the standard setter for 5G. Yeah. And, that's actually, we believe, in the Commission, a bipartisan basis again, a fundamental national security issue for us. Because if China sets the standard for 5G, our military is so reliant on some of those systems that it would be very, very bad for us. So I think that's extremely important. I'd also like to pick up on Tony's point about the unwillingness of some elements of the private sector to see themselves as American companies and therefore, as opposed to global companies, and therefore unwilling to work with particularly the Department of Defense. And we've seen some instances of that recently with Maven and the statements by Google employees, et cetera. This led General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Halifax Forum recently, to point out that, hey, we are the good guys. I think it's actually imperative for companies like Google and Facebook to understand that as much as they are global companies, they also are providing a platform for the waging of essentially political warfare against the United States every day. One of the findings of our commission was that not only are we in competition, a strategic competition in the long term with Russia and China, but in the so-called gray zone, which exists both in a geographic and in a functional way, we're actually in conflict with Russia and China every day in cyber, in information operations. This is ongoing. I mean, we tend to focus a lot in the United States right now on the Russia piece of this because of the interference in the election in 2016 and ongoing efforts by Russia to do that. But if we were having this conversation in Australia or New Zealand, the focus would be very much on China and China's effort to exert influence through non-traditional means, including electronic media and social media, et cetera. For anybody who hasn't seen it, I commend to you the Australian series Secret City, which you can see on Netflix, which kind of goes into this in some detail. You're beginning to see that discussion now in the United States about Huawei and ZTE and their role in the economy, but also the Confucius Institutes, et cetera. So this is something that is with us every day, and I think it is incumbent on companies whose platforms are being weaponized against the United States to both take that into account and to, as General Dunford said, understand who the good guys and the bad guys are here. One final comment on this. There's been a long literature going back to the 90s about the retreat of the state and the decline of the state as a unit of account in the international system and the rise of non-state actors, particularly on the economic side. When I was ambassador to Finland, Nokia had a market cap that was bigger than the GDP of the entire country. Of course, that's not the case now, but they made a couple of bad decisions that left them in the dust. But these are important factors to bear in mind. However, the state still matters, and it's still the fundamental unit of account in international affairs. And particularly in an era of great power competition, it's great to say that you're a multinational company and you're not beholden to the United States government, and you can have that view, but when the shooting starts, you're probably going to have a different view.
So one of the questions that I just want to pick up on, you mentioned that China and Russia have these plans, right, to at least undermine this liberal order or have a different vision of world order. But it seems to me that at least relatively deeply thinking Russian, Chinese strategists also don't want a complete world disorder. That doesn't really serve anybody's interest, especially if you're a great power. You're a great power because this was the world order that was created. But my question is, do you see any common threads in these, especially these illiberal regimes, of what kind of world order they would like to see instead of the one that we have now? Because it seems to me that, as I used to say, sort of in the European context, that the rallying cry of xenophobes of the world unite doesn't really work, right? So what's that? Is the alternative simply alternative spheres of influence where everybody has their own little backyard and there is no real global world order? You just have small regional orders, or how do you sort of see their view? If we had some Chinese and Russian national security experts on this panel, how would they sort of see the ideal outcome? Tony?
Well, it's just starting here, and I think starting with China, I think you would start with in effect a regional order based on their norms and interests that they would hope eventually expand outward. And look, the challenge that we have is that there really is the emergence of an alternative model to liberal democracy, or a reemergence in terms of sort of techno-autocratic states that, at least on the surface, are doing a pretty good job in delivering for their people at a time when we're having, as Kristen said so eloquently, we're having trouble doing that. And another thing I think that Kristen pointed to earlier, which is really important, is the economic domination that we enjoyed has dissipated. And there are both good reasons for that, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But there was a great scholar of democracy that some of you will remember because I think he hailed from around here. His name was J.R. Ewing. And back in the 1980s, there was something called the Dallas effect, which is to say people around the world watched Dallas and programs like it. They saw this tremendous success and wealth. They wanted the same thing, and they thought that our political system had to come along with that if they were going to achieve and aspire to what they were seeing. That's no longer the case. We're getting to a point where about 50% of the world's wealth will be generated by non-free countries. And if they're delivering, that becomes a pretty powerful model and magnet. So I think you're going to see, Russia's a different story. I mean, I see Russia as essentially a declining power, but one that's doing a tremendous amount of damage on the way down. China, on the other hand, has very different aspirations. But here's the challenge, too, for us. Even as we are rightly focusing on this new challenge, we can't have the pendulum swing, at least in my judgment, too far in the other direction. So, for example, with China, we somehow have to figure out a way to maintain a system that is open and collaborative out of our own self-interest. The innovations that we're seeing at great universities like this one in Silicon Valley, they depend to a large extent on that openness and collaboration. So if we drown the baby with the bathwater, we're going to have another problem that's going to be very hard to undo.
Well, I largely agree with what's been said. I do think the Russians and Chinese, as Tony said, both have essentially for the moment regional ambitions. China's a little more ambiguous because they have regional ambitions that could, because of their growth very rapidly, morph into more global ambitions, although we should not underestimate the scale of the problems that China faces. I mean, we tend to focus a lot on the dangers of a growing, rising China, and that's appropriate. We should. But we also should remember that China has got enormous problems. They've got enormous public debt that has funded a lot of their rise that may not be sustainable. They have a gigantic demographic challenge that has been created by the one-child policy, and you can already see its effects in China, which is the labor force is already beginning to decline. And you've seen work stoppages and pressures that have begun to push wages up in China, which have led in some cases to some U.S. enterprises returning manufacturing to the United States. You've got the so-called bare branches phenomenon, which is because of sex-selective abortion and infanticide in China. You've got, depending on which demographer you believe, somewhere between 25 million and 40 million unattached young men with no prospects for marriage, which means the country faces what my wife calls the national level problem of testosterone poisoning. And they've got enormous environmental problems that have to be remediated, the cost of which is sort of staggering. We tend to be very cognizant of the strengths that China has, and the Chinese government tends to be very wary of their weaknesses, which is why they are so, bound and determined to monitor their entire society, the social credit system, all the things that Kristen was talking about as well. So China, when you describe the problems we face in managing world order, they're enormous. And they're probably the biggest challenges this nation has ever faced because they're the most complex that we've ever had to face. I mean, Bob Gates and I used to talk about the fact that in the Cold War, those of us who were trained as Soviet experts, felt we could deal with anything because everything was a lesser included case of the U.S.-Soviet rivalry. Today we face both a great power rival in China and in Russia, although I agree with Tony that by most measures Russia is a declining power, but that doesn't mean it is not potentially very dangerous, particularly because of its large nuclear arsenal. But all things considered, if I had to choose between whose problems I'd rather have ours.
I totally agree with Eric on China's vulnerabilities, although I wouldn't want us to see us build a strategy around that view of the world. In part, I read the last kind of 20 years of U.S. policy towards China as hoping that they would make a dumb mistake. That basically we thought maybe they'll mismanage their rise in a way where they accidentally undermine the interests of the Communist Party. And anyway, I think we have a pretty clear-eyed view. the one point I'd make on this is that although we're talking about Russia and China in the same, using the same language, Tony's absolutely right. They have very different kind of longer-term trajectories. Russia has some very difficult long-term economic challenges. They're entirely dependent on energy prices. They have demographic issues. And they, over the long term, probably have some tensions with China. So right now, these countries have formed a kind of, loose alliance. But in the long term, you have a very crowded northeast China that's energy poor sitting right next to a sparsely populated, energy-rich Siberia, and I think you're going to see, that's going to create some real tensions. You also have Russian weapons sales to China at the same time that China has said they're going to make a concerted effort to basically be less dependent on other countries for advanced manufacturing. So anyway, so I think of these two blocks as sort of going in different directions over the mid to long term.
Great, thank you. Well, very reluctantly, because I want to keep asking you questions, I'm going to turn the questions over to the audience now. I ask that you please just raise your hand so I can call on you and wait for the microphone to reach you. We have people in the back who will bring a microphone towards you. And once I call on you, please identify yourself, who you are and what your affiliation is. And please keep your question brief to under 30 seconds. All of our panelists really kept to time, so I really want to make sure that we get to hear from them. Over there, Larry.
Thank you. Fascinating panel. My name's Larry O'Brien. I'm an LBJ School alumnus. My question's for Kristen, but the panel at large. You mentioned Section 232. And I guess my view, at least, is the existing liberal world order is not equipped to deal with the China state controlling and dominating the global steel industry with over 50% steel capacity. Think of the analogy as OPEC being one country and behaving accordingly. So doesn't this require the U.S. taking an uncharacteristically aggressive or assertive action to stem this risk and force action?
My objection is not to steel tariffs per se. We did them in the Bush administration. My objection is to use of this particular provision. And just as background for folks who aren't following the trade debate, there's a longstanding provision of U.S. law that basically gives the president vast discretion to do almost anything he wants to in terms of import restrictions if there's a national security threat. And historically, that's been used in a lot of cases related to oil, basically. And that, generally it's been understood to mean that if there's some particular material that has some vital kind of national security defense-related use, that the president can oppose import restrictions. The problem with that on steel and aluminum is that basically I thought, the Defense Department said basically we're fine on defense-related supplies, no worries from that end. And by the way, a lot of our suppliers are U.S. allies. So China's oversupply is causing it's disadvantaging economically U.S. producers, but it's not creating a vital national security threat. It's even worse, actually, if you think about the current debate about 232, which is the Trump administration's proposal to apply that to auto tariffs, to basically say, it's a big stretch that kind of German, auto exports are causing a national security threat to the U.S. And the reason I object to that particular provision is because every other country in the world has a similar law where basically they can create import restrictions based on national security. The GATT has an exception that allows countries to do that. And the second we start acting a little bit lawlessly, kind of making up rules as we go along, we're inviting every other country to do that. So anyway, if they had done a kind of standard, Bush administration-like steel tariff, I might have said, well, I might have liked it or not liked it, but I wouldn't have thought of it as a fundamental kind of threat to the global trading system.
I largely agree with, I totally agree with everything that Kristen said, including and the. But the premise of your question, I think, is quite correct, which is that China's predatory economic statecraft presents a challenge to us that we have been slow, and this is a bipartisan thing. I think we, in the Bush administration, I think the Obama administration, were very slow realize. And I think typically, in my view, the Trump administration's diagnosis of the problem is not necessarily wrong. The question is what the prescription is, what's the antidote to it. And my view is in a contest like this, you want to mobilize as much of the rest of the world and as many of our allies who are equally disadvantaged by what China is doing. And slapping tariffs on, our other major great power threat, Canada, doesn't seem to be consistent with mobilizing, our allies against China. I mean, by the way, our allies are thinking about this in very interesting ways. So when we met with allied representatives as part of the National Defense Strategy Commission, a lot of them were expressing similar anxieties about what China's up to, including hearing this from our European allies, which is something I hadn't heard 10 years ago when we were, in fact, Kristen and I were working on getting our European allies a little more exercised about China at that point. The French, for instance, have a very interesting, in their latest defense and national security review that was issued in 2017, they have a very interesting step that they've taken. They've been very concerned about the Chinese coming in and buying up French startups, particularly in the IT area. And so they've developed a fund to preclusively buy up vulnerable French companies so that the Chinese can't buy them up. I think that's the kind of thing we might want to have to think about. And traditionally, we've said we don't do industrial policy, we don't pick winners and losers. I think that's generally right, but in this now new competitive environment, we may have to think about new tools like that.
Yeah. I just say very quickly that I'm in violent agreement with my friends. One part of the answer is the one thing that actually united Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, except in the wrong direction, and that was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think one of the biggest self-inflicted, not only economic but strategic wounds was pulling out of TPP. And as Kristen knows better than anyone, these agreements are always imperfect. And any negotiation means compromise. You don't get everything you want. But in terms of an agreement that, at least as a practical matter, would have raised and protected workers and their rights, protected the environment, protected intellectual property, created greater transparency, created a mechanism to start to undermine the dominant role of state-owned enterprises, all of that was there. And I remember very well, just by coincidence, the day the TPP was initially agreed, I happened to be in Japan, and the Japanese were ecstatic because Prime Minister Abe played a lead role in actually bringing it to fruition. The next day I was in Seoul, South Korea. They're not an original member of the TPP, and their question was, when can we get in? But then the third day I was in Beijing, and instead of seeing the Chinese trash the agreement, it was more, we need to do something about this. Would this eventually be open to us? What would it require? They saw 40% of the world's GDP coming together in a way that Eric was describing. And then if you bring in the Europeans, you have an incredibly powerful ability to shape the international trading system in ways that are not a race to the bottom. And that's an effective tool. Unfortunately, we've abandoned it.
Can I add one point?
Sure.
Actually, to Eric's point, Senator Cornyn did lead the effort to do something really important on the topic that Eric discussed, which is sort of Chinese investments in sensitive technologies by changing the rules about how the U.S. reviews the national security implications of that, and that's now law and process. Yeah.
Great. Question in the front row.
Hello, I'm Aaron O'Connell. I'm a military historian here at UT. I'd like to ask the panel for their thoughts on how U.S. lethal counterterrorism policy has affected the global order we're discussing today. So we've conducted significant military operations in 7 countries since 2001: Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, and Libya. And a few of them are a little bit more liberal, but all of them are less stable than before the U.S. intervened. So how do we understand that? Are these lethal counterterrorism operations net contributors or net detractors to the global order?
Eric, you want to take that?
I think that we have gotten incredibly proficient at finding, fixing, and killing terrorist targets around the world. And I think that in both the Bush and the Obama administrations. I think that has had a largely beneficial effect because it has prevented us from suffering another significant mass casualty attack on the homeland, and that's not because there weren't a lot of other people trying to make it happen. So I think all of us, can, be grateful for what our folks in the special operations community have done. There are no doubt, there are some side effects that sometimes I think are problematic. But I don't really think Afghanistan is today more unstable than it was in 2001. It was already very unstable. I don't think, Yemen has had major instability for a very, very long time. I don't think the civil war in Yemen had anything to do particularly with our counterterrorist operations. And I would say the same about the Syrian civil war. That had, nothing to do with our special operations activities. So while you could say that there have been some, effects in Pakistan, for instance, in Northwest Frontier territories and whatnot. Again, Pakistan has been unstable since 1947. So I don't think that it's really contributed to Pakistan's, instability. I think the major thing I worry about is that while our military has become incredibly proficient at that, we now are facing different kinds of challenges. And because of the almost singular focus over the last 17 years on counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, I think we've lost proficiency in combined arms operations at the high end, which is what we might face if we have to deal with Russia or China in some kind of military contingency. And it's one of the reasons why, when I said at the outset, we have to decide as a nation whether we're willing to pay the price. And I know this is heresy for a Republican, but I think that means taxing ourselves to pay for it. When I frequently get pushback when I talk about from colleagues, including some of my close friends, about you keep harping on the percentage of GDP that we spend on defense. It's not really a meaningful metric because it doesn't tell you anything about what you're buying. And I agree. As Gordon England, who was Deputy Secretary of Defense when I was Undersecretary, used to say, we are what we buy. There's no question that the defense budget represents, in terms of what we buy, what we are. But there's a reason why we have that metric for our allied contributions, because it's a surrogate indicator for what we are willing to give up as American citizens in order to run this system. Kristen raised the question of our long-term fiscal health, which is extremely important. I agree with her. But having said that, if you look at any of the CBO 20-year long-term studies of the national debt, the three drivers are Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. I had a little exchange with Senator Warren in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee earlier this week, in which she took me to task for just wanting more money for the military, which I freely admitted I did. It wasn't a secret that she was eliciting. And she made the point that we can't hollow out the country by not spending on infrastructure. And I agree. We can't continue to have, both defense and non-defense fighting for the crumbs of the discretionary budget when the biggest driver of our debt is the entitlement programs, and they have to be reformed. That's where she and I parted company. She said, "Oh, you want to take money from Medicare and Social Security and have it go to defense?" And I said, "No." I didn't say this actually at the hearing, but now that I have you as an audience, I'm happy to say what I should have said to her, which is, Secretary Warren or Senator Warren, because she and I are contemporaries. We're the same age. I'm on Medicare, and I'm extremely healthy and pretty well off. Why am I on Medicare? Why isn't this means tested? Oh, by the way, this system was designed in 1962 and 63 when people like you and me had been dead for 5 years. So, you know, why is it that we can't reform this? I mean, these are things we have to do.
All right. We've got time for one more question. I'd prefer to get a question from a student if possible. So, Jonah over there.
Hey, I'm Lieutenant Jonah Redei, U.S. Air Force, and I really liked how you brought up Kennan's letter on more or less comparing the ways of life in the Soviet Union and the United States and their comparative advantages and disadvantages. And something that we've seen over history is that every time the United States reaches an inflection point in its history is that we've seen shifts in the American identity. And I was curious what your thoughts are on the changes that need to occur in the American identity today, and how do we bring that about as policymakers and as citizens?
Do you mean an observation of how it's changing or how we think it ought to change?
Preferably both.
Yeah. So the most concerning change to me is just the divisions and the sort of loss of sense that we're part of an American community and instead we're a bunch of pockets of interest groups. And I think some of that arises from the issues that Tony raised at the beginning, that on the one hand, globalization has been really good for the U.S. economy. On the other hand, in the U.S. and in countries all over the world, it's created pockets of haves and have-nots that we haven't been good at sort of managing through that in a way to make sure that that the benefits of it were shared. And so that's created resentment against other Americans and against the system itself. So to me, that's a fundamental thing, is that, and I should add, on top of that, all the other divisions, the kind of polarization in, partisan divisions. I'll say this just since Tony's here on the stage, but whenever I speak to students, one of my kind of, words of advice, if you find yourself in Washington, is to have friends on the other side of the aisle. And the story I say your life will be more interesting, they'll challenge you in ways that, that really help you. And one of the stories I sometimes tell is my second confirmation for, my first confirmation for the State Department job was Republicans held the Senate, and it was reasonably straightforward. The second confirmation, Democrats held the Senate, and Chairman Biden was the chairman of Senate Foreign Relations, and they told me, by the way, I have no idea what the Senate's going to do with your confirmation, and there's this guy who works for Senator Biden who's incredibly tough, not Tony, but this other guy who's incredibly tough on nominees, so you're going to have to go up there and you're going to get a beating. And so I said, so I went up there that day to go get pounded on by this guy, and in the middle of my pounding, Tony, who I knew and was friends with, walked in and put his arm around me and said, "We need to get this confirmation through right away." And I could see the guy just looked so crestfallen because his victim had been taken out from. Anyway, so I say that this is a total tangent, but I just say that I value so much my, friends on both sides of the aisle, and it's depressing to me that the country seems to be sort of dividing itself into partisan spheres. So I guess that's the big one, is that we've got to find some way to get back to the sense of a common kind of purpose and unity.
I largely agree with that. I think that one of the drivers, not the only one, well, there are a couple of drivers of this sort of vogue of populism and authoritarianism that we've seen around the world. And there's some pretty good social science now behind this, which is that while there's some economic element to it, which is both Kristen and Tony have talked about, the unequal distribution of the economic gains of globalization, far bigger problem has been the cultural factors, which essentially have been driven by migration. A lot of that has resulted from our failure to adequately manage the international system. I mean, the creation of these great waves of refugees, particularly over the last 7 or 8 years, that are coming from Afghanistan, from Syria, from Iraq, flowing into Europe, and from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, through Libya into into Europe have created a huge disequilibrium in the system. And by the way, the global, because it is a global phenomenon, increase of women in the workforce has been very discomforting in a cultural sense to a lot of people. The United States, given our history and where we are in the world, actually ought to do better than other countries in that kind of environment. And yet I'm deeply troubled by the fact that we're not. Some of that has to do, I think, to be fair, a little bit with the practice of identity politics. I mean, if we tell people you got to vote one way or another because of your ethnic identity, it was almost inevitable in my mind that as the United States became a majority-minority country, that the white tribe would get activated as a result of that. I think that's what we've seen. And speaking personally, because I now, as Senator Sass likes to say, consider myself an independent conservative who caucuses with Republicans, I worry that if the Republican Party, and looking at the midterm election results, if we become the party of angry white men, we will be a perpetual minority party, because there just aren't enough of us angry old white men to sustain a majority. So I think that's, and we need two healthy parties in the United States. I mean, I've been fond of telling my Democratic friends that they're going to get their time in the barrel now that they have the majority in the House, because the dysfunction on our side has been evident for everybody to see for the last decade. It's about to be your turn.
Well, I'm not the member of any organized party. I'm a Democrat. But to, and Kristen was referring before to 1946 and the year before that we got the long cable, and maybe now we're waiting for the long tweet, but we'll see if we can get beyond the 280 characters. Look, let me just say in conclusion this, and end on a somewhat optimistic note. I really believe that there is a profound constant in the American identity and the American character. And we still see it throughout the country. But I believe that because that's kind of how I was raised. So maybe it's naive, maybe it's wrong, but I still believe in it. I had a great-grandfather and grandfather who fled pogroms in what were then Russia and now Ukraine, came to the United States at the turn of the last century. They were welcomed with open arms, and they built a life. A stepmother who fled in the dead of night, communism, in Hungary, got on a train, made her way west, finally arrived in the United States, was welcomed here with open arms. And my late stepfather, who passed away a couple of years ago, he was one of 900 children in his school in Białystok, Poland. He's the only child to survive that school. He wound up, this was before World War II, but he was deported into concentration camps, Auschwitz, Majdanek, Dachau, you name them. At the very end of the war, he was on a death march out of one of the camps in Bavaria. And he and some friends made a break for it, somehow made it into the woods. And they hid out for a few days, moving at night, staying put during the day. And then one day, as they were hiding out, they heard this deep rumbling sound. And my stepdad looked out into this clearing, and instead of seeing a tank with the dreaded Iron Cross on it, or a swastika, he saw something different. He saw a 5-pointed white star. And maybe in a very foolhardy way, he ran toward the white star. And he got down in front of the tank and got down on his knees, and the hatch opened up. And a very large African-American GI looked down at him. And he looked up and he said the only 3 words that he knew in English and that his mother had taught him before the war: God bless America. And the GI lifted him into the tank, into the United States, in effect, and into freedom. That's our character. That's our identity. And I believe profoundly that it's still there. We just have to figure it out and find ways to show it again. Thank you.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end this panel on. I'd like to ask Dr. Mary Newberger to bring up her panel, which is the next one on Russia. There's not going to be a break between these 2 panels, so for everybody else, please stay in your seats. And please join me in thanking our entire panel for this great discussion.